Hi everyone, and welcome to this video where I will present a lesson on my guitar arrangement of the song When I'm Gone by Randy Newman. Now there's a lot of ground to cover, which is why this lesson is split into multiple parts. The video you're watching here is part 1 of the multi-part lesson. In part 1, I'll quickly describe the information and resources I used to create the arrangement, and it includes a short description of some of the notation and conventions I used in the tab. And this first part of the multi-part lesson introduces some building blocks and some reusable chord shapes and phrases that are used in part 2. Another thing I'll cover in part 1 is expectations. I'll describe some additional things you should expect from the lesson, as well as my expectations for you as we work through the arrangement together. And since you're here, I suppose, because you want to learn how to actually play the song, in part 1 you'll learn how to play the intro, which is the first 9 measures of the song. And if you decide to go beyond part 1, and I hope you do, the link for part 2 is in the description below, and it picks up the lesson in measure 10 and leads you all the way to the end, which in this song is measure 42. The last component of this multi-part lesson is a short video that provides some additional background information, elaborates a little on how I got started, and adds some details regarding the resources I used when I created the arrangement. A link to this background video is also provided in the description below. Now I would like to start out by first playing through the song so you can get a good idea of what the arrangement sounds like and more quickly decide if you want to continue to the lesson. But before I do that, here are a few quick points that I'd like to make. First, I'm recording this video on my phone, so my apologies in advance for any problems with the quality of the audio and the video. Second, it will soon be evident that I'm not a professional guitarist or a professional singer, which leads me to my third point, and that is this playthrough is meant to be more of a demonstration rather than any type of a performance. My goal, as I said, is to simply give you a good idea of how the arrangement sounds. And with that, let's go right to the demo. The time for us to say goodbye is near. The day I hoped would never come is here. Though many hearts are broken, we must somehow carry on, 'cause I think you're gonna miss me when I'm gone. I thought my life was over when we met. So little to remember, so much to forget. Though it was you who saw me through the darkness to the dawn, still I think you're gonna miss me when I'm gone. I'm a modest man and it hurts me to say these things to you, but after all we've been through, it's the least that I can do. So instead of just goodbye, I'll say so long. And as for the light by which you see me, leave it on. I'm a better man than I was before. Knowing you has made me strong. And I sure am gonna miss you when I'm gone. Yes, I sure am gonna miss you when I'm gone. Okay, so you made it through the demo, and if you're here, I'm going to assume you're still interested in continuing with the lesson. Now, one of the things I wanted to provide before launching into the lesson is just a quick rundown of the resources I used when I created the arrangement. And this is just a list of some videos I found on a couple of websites that I thought were useful. As you would expect, I started with a Randy Newman video of the song, which, of course, had his own piano accompaniment. And then I came across a cover of the song by Mark Starr with his guitar arrangement. And there were some elements of that arrangement that I thought were very interesting. And the last video I used was one by David Whitehead, and this version of the song, also with the piano accompaniment, was played and sung in the key of E flat instead of the key of D, but regardless of that, I still think it was very well done. The two websites I used was one called Band to Piano, and the other was scales-chords.com. I got a copy of the piano score from Band to Piano, and I used scales-chords.com to help me with some of the weird chord combinations that I found in the song. And one last thing, I provided links to all this stuff in the description below, and I want everyone to know that I'm in no way receiving any type of compensation from any of the people or organizations that I mentioned in this video. Now, before I go any further, I think it's important to set some expectations for how this lesson is laid out and how it will proceed. To begin with, I think this song, especially the piano accompaniment and the guitar accompaniment that I created from it, is a little more complicated than what most people would consider your typical song. By that I mean, yes, this song has your usual two verses, what most people would call a bridge, and a closing verse. And yes, the melody is similar across all the verses. But one of the things that makes this song unusual, interesting, and enjoyable are the variations in the way the piano was played from measure to measure. So the guitar arrangement, of course, takes into consideration those variations. And this means that I can't simply give you a list of 3 or 4 chords and show you how they repeat throughout the song. And although there are some guitar phrases that do repeat in the song, and I do take advantage of those repeating phrases in the lesson, most of the 42 measures of the song need to be addressed one measure at a time. And at the same time, there were some challenges in the piano score and some compromises I had to make in translating from the piano to the guitar. So I take a little time in the lesson to explain those challenges and compromises so you know why the guitar arrangement is put together the way it is. All this information results in a 2-part video lesson that's a little bit longer than what you'll typically see, but I hope you'll find it all worthwhile. Okay, I think it's about time we had our first look at the tab. There are some general things that I first want to explain about the tab notation, and then after that, we'll finally get to the real point of the lesson, which is to actually start learning how to play the song. So as I said before, I used the piano score from Band to Piano to create the arrangement and to actually write the tab. So I started with the piano score and I just went measure by measure through that and kind of translated that into the guitar tab. As I did that, what I tried to do is stay as closely aligned with the piano score as possible. So each staff in the tab represents or pretty much duplicates the number of measures in the corresponding piano score. That's why each staff in the tab may have more or fewer measures than any other staff in the tab. And if you look at these examples here, this first staff is measures 1 through 8, and it has, as it says, 8 measures in this first staff. But then right below that is the next staff, and that has only 3 measures in it, 9 through 11. And there are other parts of the tab that have, maybe just 2 measures in them, something like that. But either way, that lines up and matches the piano score that was the source of all this information. Another thing is that I use a personal kind of special, unconventional notation in the tab where I make some distinctions between specific notes that can be optionally played or alternately played. And what I mean by that is there are times when I'm looking at the music and I think, well, I can play this particular phrase using this shape or a totally different shape. They're mutually exclusive. And there are other times when you'll look at the tab and there'll be notes that are appear in parentheses, and those are meant to indicate that you can play them optionally, one way or the other. So here's an example where I just pulled out just a small sample of the tab, and you can see in one of the measures, there is the measure that I'm showing here, there's a shaded portion and there is a portion in parentheses. So if we were to play this measure and ignore the alternate parts and the optional notes, then it would sound simply like this. And I'll play that again just one more time so you can kind of look at it and match it up with the tab. So in this example, this measure can be played with either what I would call the primary or default shape for the G, which is here, or the alternate shape for the G, which is here. So if I were to play the whole measure using first the primary and then the alternate shapes, it would sound something like this. That's the primary default shape for the G, and here's the alternate shape instead. So you kind of get an idea of how the notation is related to the different shapes you can play. So that covers the alternate shapes that are shown in the tab. Let's talk a little bit about the optional notes that are shown in parentheses in the tab. And when the music is played, these optional notes will sometimes sound like grace notes or passing notes between the chords. So if I replay this short measure without the optional notes, it sounds like this. Now if I go ahead and play the measure with the two optional notes, it'll sound like this. And I'll try to play it a little slowly and emphasize those optional notes so you can hear them a little better. So hopefully you can hear the difference, and that covers the special notation that I use in the tabs. So why don't we just go ahead and finally get into the actual lesson. Okay, to begin with, the song is played in the key of D, and as I mentioned much earlier in the video, the David Whitehead cover, he plays it in the key of E flat, and there are times when I'll capo up to the 2nd fret and play it in the key of E. It has a slightly different sound in that key, and I kind of like that sometimes, but for the lesson, everything we do is going to be in the key of D. So in order to facilitate that, I have the guitar tuned to drop D tuning, which all of you probably know means taking the low E string and tuning it down from an E down to a D. So I kind of like the sound of that. The drop D tuning gives a more fullness to the D chord, and just kind of fills out some of the blanks that are otherwise played in standard tuning. Now, the Mark Starr cover of the song appears to be played in standard tuning, and that works for him, but as I said, I kind of like the fullness of the drop D tuning for songs that are in the key of D. I think it's worth mentioning at this point in the lesson that I'm assuming that you will have what I consider to be a certain minimal level of experience on the guitar. For example, I expect you to know the note that each open string is tuned to, and I expect you to know, or you're able to find, notes on the fretboard, but believe me, I am not an expert in that area. And I expect you to have a working knowledge of what I consider to be some basic and common chord shapes that are used in the song, although some of the chords are affected by the fact that we're in drop D tuning. But some of those common chords are, for example, A major, A seventh, G major, with some number of variations that show up in the arrangement, E major, E seventh, B minor, And since the song is written in the key of D, you'll see a lot of the D major chord. And finally, D7th, which also shows up with some number of variations in the arrangement. And since I expect you to be familiar with these chords and shapes, I will not be spending a lot of time explaining those shapes in the lesson. And if there are any challenges in playing the arrangement, I think that those challenges are probably in some of the positions on the fretboard, which would be the left hand if you're a right-handed guitar player. And there are probably very few difficulties in the right hand, mostly because the chords that are played in the song are played with what I think are referred to as block chords, where you're pretty much playing or plucking all the notes of the chord at the same time. Now I noticed when I was listening to the playthrough, I am playing a lot of these block chords, but I also noticed that I played a lot of arpeggios. In fact, I played more arpeggios than I really thought that I had, but either way, you can play it with the block chords or with arpeggios, or whatever sounds right to you. What I'm providing is the basics, or the building blocks of the song, and you can put it together any way that makes sense to you and meets your expectations. Okay, so let's get started working our way through the tab. And I think the format I'm going to try to use is to take small bites out of the arrangement, maybe 2 or 3 measures at a time, and then play through those measures to get an idea of what we're going to cover, and then get into the details and break it down, hopefully without veering off into too many long, unnecessary explanations. So let's start with the first 3 measures of the intro shown here, and I'll just play them so you can get an idea of what they sound like. Okay, let's stop right there. I know I said I wasn't going to try to get into any kind of long-winded explanations, but these first 3 measures, especially the first one, is a good representation of some of the problems that I had to solve when I was moving from the piano arrangement to the guitar arrangement. The problems begin to show up in the first 2 chords of the first measure. Now here I'm showing the piano score for that first measure, and the first chord, the D major 7th, has an A, which is really no problem, but it also has a C sharp and a D. And the problem here is that the C sharp and the D are both being played on the same string. Now if you're trying to play a 3-note chord and 2 of the notes are on the same string, then there's no way you're going to be able to play all 3 notes at the same time. A similar problem shows up in the second chord of this first measure, the G chord. This chord has a G, a B, and a D. Now if you're playing it in this position on the neck, you're either going to have to play the G and the B on the same string, or you're going to have to play the B and the D on the same string. And again, if you're trying to play a 3-note chord and 2 of the notes are on the same string, well, that's just not going to work out. So I did some experimenting to see if I could find a way to play these chords in a way that matched the piano score. And I came up with a way to play this D major 7th, but this D note on the second string is a little hard to reach. The G chord, though, that was a little easier to play. So there is a way to play these chords in one of the positions. Is a little bit of a stretch. The other one isn't too bad, but I'm not going to do that, and I didn't put those positions in the tab. I chose a different direction. So this is what I did in order to solve this problem, and I think it sounds good, and I think it's a very easy solution. So as I said before, for example, this first chord, the D major 7th, we have the A, the C sharp, and the D. Well, all I did was I took this D and I moved it from here down to here. So instead of playing, I'm playing this. It's the same chord, it just takes the D and moves it down 1 octave. I did the same thing with the second chord, with the G, where I need to play a G, a B, and a D. So again, I took this D and instead of playing it here, I play it there. So now I have the D, the G, and the B. Simple solution, and I think it sounds good. But this simple solution that sounds good presents some challenges of its own and introduces what some people might consider to be compromises. Now, if you go and you watch the video and listen to how it's played on the piano, you'll notice that the song opens up with this D note, and this D note is repeated throughout the intro, and it sounds something like this. Now, as I said before, because I'm using that D in the chords for the intro, I've decided to move that D note that opens the song and repeats throughout the intro. I've decided to move it from here to here, 1 octave down. And although I moved this D note down 1 octave, I still think it sounds good because, as I've said before, I like the depth and the fullness of the drop D tuning. But I have to admit that this D note, I'm moving this D note all over the place in the intro, and you'll see that as we finally get back into the tab. So let's jump back into the first 3 measures of the song. As a reminder, those first 3 measures sound like this. Now the song starts off, the first measure starts off with the low D played on the open 6th string. And then you place a half bar on the 2nd fret, play the open 4th string, play the 2nd fret of the 3rd string, and then the 2nd fret of the 2nd string. And the 1st string is not played for this chord. So it sounds like this. And then the second chord of the first measure is played by removing the half bar off the 2nd fret and then just playing the open 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. So the first measure sounds like this. And then this low D is the first note of the second measure. Now the rest of the second measure is played by putting the half bar back on the 2nd fret, playing the 2nd fret of the 3rd string, and when you play that 2nd fret of the 3rd string, then slide the half bar up to the 3rd fret, play the open 4th string, then play the 3rd fret of the 3rd string, the 3rd fret of the 1st string, and then the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. The third measure starts out by playing the 5th fret of the 1st string, followed by what I would call the standard normal D chord, played on the 2nd fret of the 3rd string, the 3rd fret of the 2nd string, and the 2nd fret of the 1st string. And then the third measure finishes off by playing this low D on the open 6th string. Now you may have noticed that the third measure has an optional note, which is this open 4th string. And I prefer to play that along with the D because I think it fills that D chord out just a little bit. I think it sounds a little bit better. Now there's a couple of things about these first 3 measures that I'd like to point out before we move on. One of which is related to something I mentioned a little bit earlier, and that's how I moved this D note that is used throughout the intro from here down to here. And if I play those 3 measures again, it'll point out what I'm talking about. Now I don't know if you heard that, but I emphasized this D played right here. And what I'm doing is, I'm starting out the intro with this low D. when I get here, I'm playing the D here. So the D note that keeps reappearing in the intro in my arrangement jumps from here to here. And it's a little bit of a leap, but I think it sounds okay, and I prefer to play it that way. Another thing I'll point out is that these first couple of chords are played as block chords. But when I get to the second and third measures, I switch to an arpeggio of these notes, of these chords, because I think, again, it sounds just a little bit better, and that's how I prefer to play it. All right, we're making real progress. We've covered the first three measures, so let's go ahead and jump into measures 4 and 5. And I think things will go a little bit faster now that we've covered a lot of the preliminary stuff. That stuff's out of the way. So let me start by playing the first 5 measures so you can hear measures 4 and 5 in context. Okay, so that's the first 5 measures. Measures 4 and 5 start out with measure 4, of course, with these 4 2-note pairs. And this is how the measure 4 sounds. And that D there is what launches us into measure 5. So this first 2-note pair is the 4th fret of the 4th string and the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. And then that moves to, what I do is I put a half bar on the 2nd fret and play the 2nd fret of the 3rd string and the 2nd fret of the 1st string. And then the next pair is the 2nd fret of the 2nd string and the 5th fret of the 1st string. And then the last of the 4-note pairs is the 3rd fret of the 1st string and the open 2nd string. So to play that measure again, it sounds like this. And I'll play it one note at a time so you can hear where they're coming from. Now the 4th measure leads into the 5th measure with that D note that I have said keeps reappearing in the intro. So let me play that 4th measure and show you how it leads into that 5th measure. There's that D note starting the 5th measure. Then the 5th measure goes on with the single note played on the 5th fret of the 1st string. And then I put a bar across the 3rd fret, a half bar across the 3rd fret, and play the 3rd, the 2nd, and the 1st string on the 3rd fret. And end the 5th measure with this repeating D note. So once more, slowly, measures 1 through 5. Now these first 5 measures kind of round out the all the things that I was talking about with respect to this D note, this repeating D note being here, or that D note being here. So I'll play through these first 5 measures one more time, and I'll emphasize and point out where this D note is jumping around, because I switch it around even one more time in the 4th and the 5th measure. So it starts out like this, with that low D. There's the D again. There's the D repeating, but at 2 octaves higher. There's the low D again. Now in measures 4 and 5, I play the D here on the open fourth string. So that's how I'm moving that D note all around. And as I said, solving some of the problems with playing these 3-note chords and resolving how this repeating D note is played, I said I would have to make some compromises, but I think those compromises work out. I like the way it sounds, and so that's the way I choose to play it. The next part of the song we're going to look at is measures 6, 7, and 8. Now, measures 6, 7, and 8 I think are more interesting than the measures that we've covered so far. And one of the reasons is because these 3 measures have a lot of reusable things inside of them. For example, measures 6, 7, and 8 all by themselves, they repeat in other parts of the song. So what we'll do is we'll learn the measures here, and then when we come across the same chord progressions and shapes and phrases in the other parts of the song, then I'll just refer to measures 6, 7, and 8. We can just breeze right through it and then move on through the arrangement. Another thing is that measures 6, 7, and 8 have some reusable shapes inside of it that will reappear in the rest of the arrangement, in the rest of the song, in various forms. So again, we learn them here and then we can reuse them there. One last thing I'll mention about these 3 measures is that much earlier on in the video, I mentioned that there were some parts of the arrangement that were more difficult to play on the fretboard with the left hand. Some of the shapes and the transitions between shapes more difficult with the left hand than the right hand. And there are some parts of measures 6, 7, and 8 that are a little bit more difficult than what we've seen so far in the first 5 measures, but it's not something I think that cannot be overcome. I mean, I learned how to play it, so I think if I can do it, you can do it as well. So I'll go ahead and start by playing measures 6, 7, and 8. And what I'll do is I'll lead into it by playing measures 4 and 5 first. Oh, by the way, what I just played, I went beyond measures 6, 7, and 8 and skipped ahead a little bit to measure 9 just to kind of close out the phrase, just so you know. Now the 6th measure starts out with this D chord with this shape. Now I'm going to stop right there because this D and this D shape may not be the most important shape and chord in the whole arrangement, but it's one of the most important. And the reason I say that is because this chord and this shape with minor variations appear all over the place. So we're going to learn it here, and I'll refer to this as the C-shaped D, so that when we see it in other parts of the song, I can just say, play the C-shaped D, and you'll know what I'm talking about. Now this C-shaped D, or what I'm calling the C-shaped D, is formed by playing the 4th fret of the 4th string, the 2nd fret of the 3rd string, and the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. Now, if you look at this chord chart here, the reason I'm calling this the C-shaped D is because if you take the shape that I just described and you put a half bar on the 2nd fret, then you pick up that 2nd fret of the 1st string, which is shown as a gray dot on the chord chart. And then if you plant your pinky on the 5th fret of the 5th string, which is also shown by a gray dot on the chord chart, this begins to represent your standard C shape. And if you move it down 1 fret, and play that, that's D flat or C sharp. If you move it down 1 more fret, that's your standard C shape. Now it looks a little bit weird because I was playing that half bar, but this is your standard C shape, C sharp D. So we have this C shaped D, and I'll refer to this in other parts of the arrangement, and if you learn how to play it here, then when I mention it later on, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So backing up just a little bit, this first chord of the 6th measure is a version of the C-shaped D that has a low D played on the open 6th string. And coming up pretty soon is a version of the C-shaped D that has an A played on the open 5th string. But that's getting us a little ahead of ourselves, so hopefully we'll see that in the next few minutes. The next chord in the 6th measure is this A chord. But I want to mention real quickly that I had said earlier that there are some challenges in the arrangement and in measure 6, 7, 8 with respect to the left hand playing some of the shapes and the transitions in the left hand. But as far as the right hand is concerned, the right hand is relatively simple because all the chords we're playing in this part of the intro are all block chords. So the right hand shouldn't be a problem. Okay, getting back to this second chord in the 6th measure, this is an A chord, and for the most part is your standard A that most people have seen before, where you play the 2nd fret of the 2nd, 3rd, and the 4th string. Now, I prefer to play this with my index, middle, and ring finger. I've seen people play this A shape with their pinky, ring, and middle finger. I really never have gotten used to that. And I suppose it's possible to play this A chord with maybe a bar on the 2nd fret and play the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th string with that bar. But one of the things that's a little bit different about this A chord is that it has this E on the 6th string. Now, I don't usually like to play or prefer to play with my thumb on the E string. I'm getting more used to it. There are more songs that I'm playing that require that to be played. But as far as this intro is concerned, playing that E note on the 6th string is necessary, or mostly necessary. If you look at the tab, you'll notice that there's an alternate shape there that I'll get to in just a little bit. But if it's not necessary, I would say that it is strongly preferred. And I'll get back to that alternate shape in just a little bit. The next chord, which is the 3rd chord in the 6th measure, is this D7th. Now this D7th is a little bit odd in that the D7th that most of us are used to playing is right here. But in the intro, in this 6th measure, the F sharp of this D7th is moved from here down to here, or up to here, depending on how you look at it. So for this D7th, you play the 4th fret of the 6th string, the open 4th string, the 2nd fret of the 3rd string, and the 1st fret of the 2nd string. And I'll just go ahead and move right on to the 1st chord of the 7th measure, which transitions from here to here. And this is an easy transition. It's just taking the pinky from the 4th fret of the 6th string and moving it up to the 5th fret of the 6th string and just playing this G, which is, as I said, the 5th fret of the 6th string, the open 4th string, the open 3rd string, and the open 2nd string. As I said much earlier in the lesson, gosh, it seems like ages ago, there are some parts of the left hand that are more challenging because of some of the shapes and the transitions between those shapes. And this 6th measure of the intro is a good example of that. And by that I mean the 6th measure starts out with this relatively relaxed shape, this D, and then it transitions to this A shape, which is very tight. It's almost like making a fist on the fretboard. And then it transitions from this very tight shape to this very open shape of this D7th. And transitioning from here to here takes a little bit of practice. And another thing that makes this transition a little bit different and a little more challenging is the fact that when you play this somewhat relaxed shape of this D, you have this low D that sustains between this chord and the next chord. So you have that low D that helps you transition to the next chord, but when you're playing this shape, all the notes you're playing, there are no open strings being played in this shape. So when you transition from here to the next shape, which is this very open shape, there are no open strings to sustain as you move from one shape to the next. So that's going to take a little bit of practice to make that transition sound as smooth as possible. Now, one last thing I want to mention before we leave the 6th measure of the intro is this alternate shape that's shown in the shaded portion of the tab. Now, what I'll call the primary position in the tab is this very closed and tight A shape, and this alternate position is meant to replace that tight shape with a somewhat more relaxed position of this A7th, played with the open 5th string, the 2nd fret of the 4th string, the open 3rd string, and the 2nd fret of the 2nd string. Now, one reason for playing this somewhat more relaxed A7th is that if you find it difficult to make the transition between this very tight A shape and this D7th, this somewhat more relaxed A7th makes it an easier transition from there to the D7th. And another thing that makes it a little bit easier is the fact that when you play this A7th, there's some open strings that will provide a sustained note between this shape and the D7th. Now, one reason for not playing this alternate position is something I haven't mentioned yet, and that is this bass line that is supported by all of the primary positions in the 6th, 7th, and 8th measures of the intro. And that bass line sounds like this. So when you play the primary positions for the 6th measure and beyond, it sounds like this. And if you choose to play this alternate position instead in the 6th measure, it kind of changes or messes up that bass line. So with the alternate position, it sounds like this. So instead of that bass line going like this, it goes like this. So if you're able to play the primary position for this A and easily or relatively easily make that transition between those two shapes, then that's, I think, the preferred way to play it. But if the only way you can play it is with the alternate position, then you can go ahead and play it that way. And just have to recognize that the bass line is going to be a little bit different in the song than I think what was originally intended. All right, getting back into the tab, I think the last thing we covered was, let me see, it was the last chord of the 6th measure, which is this D7th, followed by the first chord of the 7th measure, which is this G. And this G is played with the 5th fret of the 6th string, and then the open 4th, 3rd, and 2nd string. Now the next chord in the 7th measure, the 2nd chord of the 7th measure, is this C-shaped D. Now I explained what the C-shaped D is earlier in the lesson, so if you don't know what this is, then you're just going to have to go back and listen to it because I'm not going to explain it again here. But this particular C-shaped D is played with the open 5th string. So you get the A of the open 5th string, and then the rest of that C-shaped D. The next chord, the 3rd chord in the 7th measure, is this A sharp diminished 7th. Now I'll be honest with you, I don't know an A sharp diminished 7th from a E flat augmented 9th. But what I did was, I went to scales-chords.com, which is a website I mentioned at the very beginning of this lesson, and I plugged in these notes, and scales-chords.com spit out A sharp diminished 7th, so that's what I put in the tab. And this chord is played with, starting with a shape that's very much like an A7th. It's got the 2nd fret of the 4th string, the open 3rd string, and the 2nd fret of the 2nd string. And then you add this A sharp, which is the 1st fret of the 5th string. And that's the A sharp diminished 7th. The 7th measure finishes up with this last chord that I would describe as just a regular standard B minor. So it goes from this A sharp diminished 7th to the B minor, and I play this B minor by putting a bar on the 2nd fret and getting the 2nd fret of the A string, and then playing the 4th fret of the 4th string, the 4th fret of the 3rd string, and the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. The eighth measure, which is the last measure in this sequence of measures 6, 7, and 8, looks like it starts out with this B minor. But I borrowed this notation from the piano score, and the piano score included this tie between the B minor of the end of the 7th measure and the beginning of the 8th measure. And this tie is only there to indicate that the duration of that last chord of the 7th measure is supposed to spill over into the early part, the beginning of the 8th measure. So do not replay that B minor in the beginning of the 8th measure. So really, the only chord in the 8th measure now is this G sharp diminished. Now, the only reason I think I know this is the G sharp diminished is because, again, I went to scales-chords.com, plugged in the notes of this chord, and what it spit out was a G sharp diminished chord. Well, it also says that this chord is got the same notes in it as maybe an E7th. And the E7th does sound a lot like the G sharp diminished, but one of the things that the G sharp diminished played in this position has that the E7th does not provide is the end of that bass line that I described earlier that goes like this. And it's this note that this G sharp diminished, this is a G sharp by the way, this G sharp diminished provides for the end of that phrase. There's another thing that this G sharp diminished provides that I almost forgot to mention. If you watch the Randy Newman video that I talked about way at the beginning of this lesson, and if you listen very closely to the piano accompaniment, you'll hear an E played in this last chord of the 8th measure, the G sharp diminished. But when I looked at the piano score that I got from band to piano, I noticed that this E note was missing. So I sort of added it to the piano score, and then of course I made sure to add it to the tab as well. So this G sharp diminished is played with the 6th fret of the 6th string, the 7th fret of the 5th string, open 4th, the 7th fret of the 3rd string, and then an open 2nd and 1st string. So this is one of those chords. I finish off this sequence with an arpeggio that plays all 6 strings. And then this transitions into measure 9, which I'll get to in just a minute, but sounds like this. There's the G sharp diminished, and then a D, and an A7. The last thing we need to do with the intro is to finish up measure 9. Now, I've already played measure 9 informally 2 or 3 times already, but now let's go ahead and take a closer look at what's inside measure 9, which it really isn't much, and then we'll be done with the intro. So what I'll do is I'll play into measure 9 by starting off with measures 6, 7, and 8. So that was measure 9, which was the last 2 chords in that phrase that I just played. Now those 2 chords, the D and the A7th, are chords that most people should be very familiar with. The only things that are noteworthy about these 2 chords is that for the D, I play this open 4th string, and for the A7th, I play an arpeggio across 5 of the strings with the open 5th string for the A. And that's really all there is to measure 9. Well, that brings us to the end of part 1 of this lesson. And just to recap, part 1 contains the playthrough. It got us oriented with some information and resources that I used for the lesson. And in part 1, you learned how to play the intro, and you saw some reusable parts of the arrangement that we will take advantage of in part 2. So the link for part 2 is in the description below, and in part 2 we will look at the parts of the song that contain the lyrics starting in measure 10. So, I'll see you in part 2.